y'all, Dixie here. As a continuation of the Tips Every Backpacker Should Know series, today I want to talk to y'all about condensation, how to prevent it and how to mitigate it if you find yourself dealing with it. Nobody likes being rained on, but it's even worse if you feel like you have your own little microclimate rainstorm inside the tent. So first, let's talk about ways to prevent condensation, and then the mitigation tips will follow. Tip number one, don't camp near water. I know that it is nice to camp near a water source, so if you have to make multiple trips for water, you're not having to walk a bunch of extra distance. And with being right there, you can hydrate and use as much as you want at camp. But the closer you are to water, the more moisture is going to be in the air, so therefore leading to more condensation in your tent or other shelter. Tip number two is avoid setting up on grass. It can look lush and inviting, but because it tends to collect condensation in the early morning and plants transpire during the day and night, this can lead to more condensation in your shelter. So if you can set up on leaves or even just the bare dirt, that's going to keep things more dry. Tip number three is keep wet gear outside of your tent. If it's currently raining, then this tip may not make much of a difference, but especially if you got rained on in the late afternoon and once you got to camp, you're soaked and your stuff is wet, but the sky has cleared up and it's probably not going to rain through the night, then getting that wet gear outside of your tent and hanging it up on a branch or something and allowing it to dry out and evaporate into the great nothingness is a lot better than it being inside of your tent and then that moisture trying to rise up out of your wet stuff into the ceiling of your tent. Tip number four, select a shelter that has adequate ventilation. In a hammock, you're obviously going to have a whole lot of ventilation if you've got just a rain fly over your hammock set up and you've got a decent amount of space. There's just a lot of airflow that's able to go through there. But in a tent or a bivvy, this becomes a little bit more important to pay attention to the design and be sure that you've got some way to ventilate your space. Double wall tents definitely help because typically you've got a mesh inner wall and then the solid outer rain fly, so any moisture tends to collect on that outer wall on the inside of the rain fly and then fall down to the ground from there. But even with single wall tents, picking something that has vent flaps or one that has vestibules on either side of the tent that you can open up and allow a cross breeze to come through would be helpful. With bivvies, this one's a tough one because you're going to be in a tight enclosure with all of your heat and breath radiating from you. I don't have a whole lot of experience with bivvies, but I would still say if there's a design that focuses on ventilation, I'd go with that one over the one that does not. Also in the realm of ventilation, make sure you understand how your shelter setup is meant to handle condensation. If you've got a double wall tent, you want to make sure that that outer rain fly is taut and pulled away from the inner mesh wall so they're not touching and then that moisture dripping inside your tent. With a single wall tent, many of these have bathtub floors that have a little mesh lining around them, so condensation can run down the inside of the tent walls and through that mesh. So you want to make sure you don't have your bathtub floor pushed out past the wall of that tent, so then the condensation just runs down into the floor of your tent. Tip number five, hang your wet gear out to dry during your daily breaks. If you wake up and it's rained throughout the night or you just have a bunch of moisture in your tent because of where you camped or the conditions of the air, then when you stop for your lunch break, if it's sunny out, lay your stuff out to dry. Sure, you could stuff it away and just not worry about it and let it keep being wet until you get to camp and deal with it then, but you're setting yourself up for more condensation that night than if you just take the little bit of extra time to lay it all out during your lunch break, and that way you're starting with a dry, clean slate. Tip number six, carry along an absorbent pad. You can use something like a piece of a ShamWow or some Swedish dishcloth. I have used bandanas before, but they're not as absorbent as other things. But first thing in the morning, you can wipe your walls down if you notice some condensation. That way you're not bumping into it and making it rain all over you and your gear as you're getting ready in the morning. Also, you can wipe as needed when you get to camp in the evening. Tip number 7 is make sure your tent or bivvy or whatever you use is big enough. Not only will more space help reduce condensation, but making sure that your shelter is especially long enough to where if condensation does build up, your feet aren't bumping it through the night and soaking your foot box on your sleeping bag or quilt. I would especially pay attention to this if you have a super thick sleeping pad, because that's going to give you less horizontal space. Tip number 8, consider backpacking in drier climates. This is kind of a no-brainer, but I just want to remind those of y'all who maybe are just getting into backpacking, if you're terrified of the idea of condensation, or maybe you're experienced and you just hate dealing with it. There are areas like Utah and Colorado that you can go and backpack and not deal with as much moisture in the air because the air is drier. So you want to think more states along the Pacific Crest Trail and Continental Divide Trail instead of on the East Coast where, say, the Appalachian Trail runs through. Tip number 9 is embrace the suck. Sometimes, no matter what you do, you're still gonna have condensation in your tent and you're just gonna have to suck it up and deal with it. But I assure you, once you get home to your nice, dry house and comfortable bed, you're gonna appreciate it even more not having to struggle with condensation. Well, all right, y'all, that is all of the tips I have for you today on dealing with condensation. If you have any that I did not mention that have worked for you, please feel free to leave those in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video or found the content useful, don't forget to check out the other tips every backpacker should know videos, and I'll link to the playlist of this series in the video description. Thank y'all for watching, and we will see y'all next time.